Hi. One of the genuine fears that I have is that I will forever be one of those people that talks about writing or one of those people that sits and thinks about stories and never actually does I don't actually ever complete the story. But regardless, I had some ideas, I had some thoughts about story worlds, and I brought them. So here's the very first one, right? And I think when I'm making these, I think specifically for writers, but this might also help if you're just like one of those creative people in general. But like when you have a story world, like the idea sometimes is like, oh, it's the world of the story that's very compelling. That is true. The world of the story can be very wondrous and full of surprises, and of course, it's enjoyable. But on some level, the reader, the person that walks into the story world, they come in willing to believe the world of the stories. They come in willing to accept like the terms and conditions that exist in the story. So, for example, you will often have things that happen inside a story that might not necessarily happen in our reality, right? So, for example, I have a glass of water. Now, if I were to tip this glass of water, the water would fall on me. But in a story, right, the glass of water, just as it's about to tip over, it might turn into a glass full of pearls. Instead of tipping over, it might just scatter all around and sparkle, which would create perhaps a really lovely image. But then that loveliness is subjective. The way that it holds you, yeah, sometimes it can hold you because you're like, oh, that's an image, but also you gotta accept or take in, okay, that this is how it is. So I think the first one with story worlds is something that's helpful for me to remember both as a reader as well as a writer is the person that walks through the story world on some level, they're willing to accept. On some level, they suspend their belief, their sense of reality, and they walk through that world ready to see what happens next. And that's just nice to remember. It's nice to remember for like writing and creation, but it's also nice to remember because sometimes I think this can be applied to other situations also. The second is that your world might look like the world that you're trying to create. And sometimes this can be obvious to other people, right? So sometimes they can come along to us and they can be like, oh, you're so imaginative. Or, oh, you're so, whimsical. Or, oh, you really look like you belong to that era. Or I could totally see you being like a fairy or a witch, etc. Those are little comments that sometimes um, can just catch us off guard, maybe. The reason that I think, I mean, yes, your world looks like the world that you're trying to create, but sometimes, because the world is not there, right? Like if you have like if somebody was to be like, oh, that's so Game of Thrones, like people know exactly which kind of genre, which kind of scenario, like you will have the backdrop inside your mind, right? But for somebody who is trying to create a new world, because that world is not built yet, we tend to maybe measure ourselves a little bit differently, or we tend to think that we've fallen short because we haven't made the world yet, so how can we be part of that world? But let me elaborate, right? So the reading lists that you have, the films that you watch, the art that you gravitate towards, the colors that you really like, the sounds that fill up your head, the sound like playlists that you might have, the spaces that you like light up, the places that you also go, the workshops that you attend, because you're constantly studying these things or you're constantly moving towards these things because you're doing your best in your time to sort of take all these little fragments, right? You take all these little pieces, stitch them up, and somehow just create the world that you want to. One of the ways that I can sort of expand on this is by maybe taking up something like historical fiction, right? So it's a popular genre, it's a well established genre, but in order for that text or in order for that film to have its strength, there's probably a lot of study that kind of went into it, right? So if somebody wanted to write a historical fiction piece, or maybe even like a fantasy piece, because sometimes like these historical contexts and fantasy can kind of overlap, they probably went to a bunch of sites. They probably looked at like little things, right? So maybe they really took down like note of all the colors. Like most of the castles are maybe gray, so when they're thinking about their backdrop or when they're thinking about their description for a passage that they want to write, they know which words to use, they know which ways to describe that place. They can think about like fabric. They can think about fabrics that might have been used by people like nobility versus like somebody who was just working. They can look at historical texts, of course. But yeah, so like the world that you operate in is not necessarily like it's not necessarily separate from the world that you're trying to create. And I think it just sometimes we forget that, but it is helpful to just kind of remember as we go along, writing or scribbling or imagining and then creating. Oh, another example for this, like I was thinking about like historical fiction for sure, because I think that was easier for me to explain. But another example for this might be like, for example, that you're thinking about like writing a novel, or you're thinking about writing a short story, or you're thinking, and you want it to be like, you want it to be like its own distinct sort of story world. And I know I'm thinking about fantasy a little bit more, but you know, for example, like you're thinking about Earth, right? You're thinking about, let's say you're thinking about Earth magic, or you're story is very rooted in like how things can seem calm but then they can crack, and the metaphor or the image of the earth is very important there. Something, for example, that you might do in your day-to-day ordinary life that might help you build your understanding of your story world that you're trying to create might be, maybe you really like clay, maybe you really spend like a lot of time just at like the wheel and like feeling it, so that way you will have like an in-depth understanding of the thing that you're trying to create, and it comes from like a very ordinary piece of life. And my third insight regarding story worlds is the characters that you love are clues. They can be clues towards the kind of people that you might gravitate towards later in life or even currently. Or they can be sort of clues towards traits that you wish that you embodied yourself, right? So, for example, like a group of street children, for like, can be like a recurring sort of feature in stories and in films and in movies, etc. Because those are also stories. They can be really mischievous. They can sort of irritate the society around them, or but the dynamic amongst them is just really like, it's just, the dynamic amongst them is just heartwarming in a way. You can also have like those characters who are fun, you know, like whenever that character enters, you know something good's about to happen, or you know you're gonna laugh, or uh, like it's just gonna make you feel good in a way, right? So, for example, you could have like one of those sort of strange aunts or uncles, and then the main character comes along, the protagonist comes along, and in a moment of crisis, it's that character, like the fun aunt or uncle. Like they're generally like a little out of it, but the second that like the protagonist has like a crisis, they know exactly what to say, or they know exactly what to do, and in that process, they kind of gently reroute the protagonist back to their original journey. But it's the way that they do it, the way that you as a reader, this, like you secondhand feel warm and safe. That could be a moment. You can also have like certain other characters, like, okay, I'm thinking about like Harry Potter now, but like, you know, Professor Lupin, Professor McGonagall, those might be people that you like, you look at the traits that they have, and you could be like, oh, that's the kind of person that I want to be when I grow up. Or you could look at like a very powerful witch, right? Like, you know, every single time she's gonna come and she's gonna do something right, or she's gonna, I don't know, you could look at her strength, you could look at her bravery, you could look at her courage, you could look at her ability to sort of stand up to injustice, and that might be like the thing that you really admire. So the characters within a story world that you latch onto, they're wonderful to observe and to witness within the story world, but they can also tell us a lot about the kinds of people that we want to become. And when you're writing a story, it's just nice. I guess when you're writing a story, but even when you're reading a story, and even when you're reflecting, I think that that's a nice thing just to remember.